I never thought love could make a person invisible. When I look back now, I realize it didn't happen all at once. I didn't wake up one morning and suddenly become unimportant. It happened slowly, quietly, day by day, sacrifice by sacrifice, until one day I looked around and realized that the very people I had given my life to no longer saw me at all. I was a provider before I was anything else. Before I was tired, before I was lonely, before I was forgotten. I built my entire existence around my family. Every decision I made, every opportunity I turned down, every sleepless night, I told myself it was worth it. Because that's what love is supposed to be, right? You give, you endure. You stay quiet so others can be comfortable, and I did, for decades. I remember the early years clearly. We didn't have much, but we had each other. Or at least that's what I believed. I worked long hours, sometimes 2 jobs at a time, coming home exhausted but satisfied knowing the bills were paid, the fridge had food, and my children had shoes that fit their feet. I missed birthdays. I missed school events. I missed vacations, not because I didn't care, but because someone had to hold everything together. That someone was me. While others slept, I planned. While others dreamed, I worked. While others complained, I stayed silent. I told myself, one day they'll understand. One day they'll appreciate this. But appreciation has a way of disappearing when sacrifice becomes expected. At first, it was small things. No thank you, no acknowledgement, no questions about how tired I was or how my day went. Then it became assumptions. They assumed I would always be there. They assumed I would always pay. They assumed I would always fix things. And slowly, I stopped being a person and became a function. I was no longer mom or dad. I was just there. I remember the first time it truly hurt. I had come home after a 14-hour shift. My body ached, my head throbbed, and all I wanted was a quiet evening. Instead, I walked into complaints. Why wasn't dinner ready earlier? Why hadn't I handled a bill sooner? Why was I always tired? Not one person asked why I was tired. I swallowed my frustration and said nothing. Because that's what I always did. Silence became my habit. Endurance became my identity. As the years passed, my children grew. Their needs changed, but the expectations didn't. I paid for education, helped with rent, covered emergencies, and stepped in whenever life fell apart for them. They called when they needed something. They disappeared when they didn't. And I told myself that was normal, that this was just what family does. But somewhere deep inside, a quiet voice whispered, "What happens when you need something?" I ignored that voice, big mistake. The moment everything truly changed came when my health began to decline. Nothing dramatic at first, just exhaustion that didn't go away, aches that lingered, and nights where sleep felt impossible. I mentioned it once at dinner. I've been feeling really tired lately. No one looked up from their phones. One of my children shrugged. You're always tired. That was it. No concern, no follow-up, no care. That was the moment I realized something terrifying. They didn't see my sacrifices as love. They saw them as obligation, and obligations don't get appreciated. I kept going anyway, because stopping felt impossible. My entire worth had become tied to what I provided. If I wasn't useful, who was I? Years later, when my children had families of their own, I thought things would change. I thought distance might bring respect. Instead, it made me even easier to forget. Visits became rare, calls became short, conversations became transactional. How are you? Fine. Good, by the way, can you help with? That's when I realized I had raised people who knew how to take, but not how to notice. Still, I stayed quiet, because I believed love meant patience. Then came the moment that broke me, a family gathering, everyone together, laughter, noise, stories being shared, except no one was talking to me. I sat there like furniture, present but unnecessary. At one point, someone joked, "You don't really do much these days anyway." Everyone laughed. I smiled, but something inside me cracked. I had done everything. I had given everything, and now, according to them, I did nothing. That night, alone in my room, I asked myself a question I had avoided my entire life. What if I stop? What if I stop giving? What if I stop fixing? What if I stop sacrificing? The answer scared me, because deep down I knew the truth. They wouldn't notice, until it was too late, And that realization was the beginning of everything unraveling. After that night, the night I realized I had become invisible, I didn't confront anyone. I didn't cry in front of them. I didn't demand respect or appreciation. I did something far more dangerous. I started pulling back, not dramatically, not in a way that would immediately raise alarms. I simply stopped overextending myself. I stopped jumping every time someone called. I stopped fixing problems that weren't mine to fix. I stopped filling the gaps they never noticed were being held together by me. And for a while, no one noticed. That hurt more than anything. Days passed, then weeks. My phone stayed silent longer than usual. When it did ring, it wasn't concern. It was expectation. Hey, can you help with this? Can you cover that bill just this once? Can you watch the kids? We're busy. No, how are you? No, are you okay? No, you've been quiet lately. I realized something chilling. They didn't miss me. They missed what I provided. So I began saying something I had never allowed myself to say before. No. The first time the word left my mouth, my heart raced. I felt guilty immediately, like I had committed some unforgivable crime. I can't right now, I said calmly. There was a pause on the other end of the line. What do you mean you can't? They asked, confused. Not angry, confused, as if the concept itself didn't make sense. I'm tired. I said, I need rest. Another pause, then annoyance. Well, okay, I'll figure something out. The call ended quickly. No concern, no follow-up, but something else happened. The next call came sooner than usual. They needed something again. This time, I hesitated. My body reacted before my mind. Tight chest, shallow breath, familiar anxiety. For decades, my identity had been built around being dependable. Saying no felt like erasing myself. Still, I said it again. I really can't. That's when the tone changed. You're being difficult lately. Difficult. After a lifetime of sacrifice, I was now difficult for choosing myself once. That word stayed with me all night. I started replaying memories, moments I had brushed off, excuses I had made for them, ways I had minimized my own exhaustion. The signs had always been there. When I got sick and still cooked dinner. When I worked through pain because others needed me. When my feelings were labeled as overreacting, I had trained them to expect endless giving. And now, the moment the supply slowed, irritation replaced gratitude. At the next family gathering, the shift was obvious. They noticed, not my exhaustion, not my silence, but my absence from their convenience. Someone asked, "Why haven't you been helping as much lately?" I shrugged. I'm slowing down. That simple sentence landed like an insult. Another voice chimed in, half joking, half serious. Must be nice to suddenly slow down. I looked around the table. Faces I had sacrificed for, lives I had supported, and not one of them asked why I needed to slow down. That was when the loneliness truly set in. Not the kind where you're alone, but the kind where you're surrounded and still unseen. I began noticing how differently they treated each other. Compliments were exchanged freely, support was offered quickly, empathy flowed, just not in my direction. I was the foundation. Foundations aren't admired. They stepped on. At home, the silence grew heavier. Without my constant movement, the house felt different. Things went undone. Small problems piled up, and slowly. Frustration grew. Why hasn't this been handled? Why is this late? Why didn't you remind us? I answered calmly each time. I didn't realize it was my responsibility. That sentence made them uncomfortable because it forced them to confront something they had avoided for years. They had built their comfort on my exhaustion. One evening, I overheard a conversation that shattered whatever hope I still had. I don't know what's wrong with them lately. Someone said, they've changed. They're not as helpful anymore. Not once did anyone ask why I had changed. Only how it affected them. That night, I sat alone and did something I had never done before. I imagined a future where I gave nothing. No money, no time, no emotional labor, and for the first time, I felt relief, but relief was quickly followed by fear, because I knew something else was coming. When people get used to taking, they don't respond well when the supply ends, and soon, very soon, the pressure would turn into blame. I saw it in their eyes already, the unspoken accusation, the growing resentment, the quiet calculation of what I still owed them. They had mistaken my love for obligation. And now that obligation was slipping through their fingers, I didn't know it yet, but this was only the beginning, because the moment I truly stopped sacrificing, they would finally notice, not with gratitude, but with anger, and that anger would reveal exactly how much, or how little, I had ever been valued. It didn't take long for the tension to surface. When you stop giving people everything, they don't see it as self-care. They see it as betrayal. At first, the comments were subtle, passive, disguised as jokes. You used to be so reliable. Guess you're enjoying your me time now. Must be nice to not worry about everyone else. Each sentence carried the same message. You are failing us. I tried to ignore it. I told myself this discomfort was temporary, that they just needed time to adjust. But deep down, I knew better. They weren't adjusting. They were keeping score. The real confrontation came one evening when I was called into a family discussion. The tone alone told me everything. This wasn't concern. This was judgment. We need to talk. Someone said. I sat down quietly, my heart heavy but steady. I had prepared myself for this moment, even though I didn't know exactly what would be said. You've been distant. Another voice added, you're not contributing like you used to. There it was, not are you okay, not what's going on with you, just contribution. I took a breath. I've been tired. I've given a lot over the years. I'm slowing down. The room went quiet, but not with understanding. With all due respect, someone replied, we've all made sacrifices. That sentence hit me harder than any insult, because it erased decades of what I had done. I looked around the room. Faces that had leaned on me for years now looked at me like I was selfish, like I was hoarding something that belonged to them. I never said you didn't sacrifice. I said calmly, I'm saying I can't keep doing everything. Another voice jumped in, sharper this time. So what? We're just supposed to struggle now. There it was again. Your exhaustion is less important than our comfort. I felt something shift inside me, not anger, clarity. For years, I said slowly, I handled things so you wouldn't have to struggle. Someone scoffed, that was your choice. My choice, the nights I didn't sleep. The jobs I didn't leave, the dreams I put on hold, all reduced to a choice they no longer appreciated. That's when the labels began, selfish, cold, changed. They spoke about me like I wasn't even in the room. I don't recognize you anymore. You're not the same person. They were right, I wasn't. I was someone who had finally stopped disappearing for others, but instead of recognizing growth, they saw loss. Loss of control, loss of convenience, loss of what they took for granted. The conversation ended without resolution. No apologies, no understanding, just tension hanging in the air like a storm waiting to break. After that night, things got worse. Calls became confrontational. Requests turned into demands. Silence became punishment. When I didn't immediately respond, I was accused of withdrawing love. When I stood firm, I was told I was hurting the family. I started questioning myself. Am I wrong? Am I really being selfish? That's the dangerous part of lifelong sacrifice. It trains you to doubt your right to exist without guilt. But then something happened that erased all doubt. A situation came up, a serious one. A financial issue. In the past, I would have stepped in without hesitation. No questions asked, no limits. This time I said no, not angrily, not dramatically, just no. The reaction was immediate, voices raised. Accusations flew. How can you do this to us? After everything we've done for you, you're tearing this family apart. I sat there, stunned. Everything they'd done for me. That's when I realized something devastating. In their version of the story, I owed them. My sacrifices hadn't been acts of love. They were debts. And now that I was no longer paying, I was being punished. That night, I went home and cried. Not out of weakness, but out of grief. Grief for the years I had given freely. Grief for the love I thought was mutual. Grief for the realization that my worth had always been conditional. I understood then that boundaries don't just reveal who respects you. They reveal who benefits from your silence, and my silence had benefited them for a very long time. The breaking point was no longer approaching, it had arrived, and in the next phase, the truth would become impossible to ignore, because when people feel entitled to you, they don't let go quietly. They push harder, and soon they would push too far. After that confrontation, something inside me went quiet, not calm, not peaceful, just numb. I stopped trying to explain. For years, I had explained everything. My exhaustion, my choices, my limits. I had wrapped my pain in polite words so no one else would feel uncomfortable. But after being painted as the villain for protecting what little strength I had left, I realized something painful and freeing at the same time. People who benefit from your sacrifice don't want explanations. They want compliance. So I stopped defending myself. When they complained, I listened without reacting. When they accused, I stayed silent. When they guilted me, I didn't argue. And that silence unsettled them more than any argument ever had. Without my explanations, they were forced to sit with their own behavior, and they didn't like it. The distance between us grew quickly after that. Family group chats went quiet when I spoke. Invitations stopped coming as often. When I was included, it felt forced, like an obligation rather than a desire. I wasn't missed. I was managed. They checked in just enough to say they did. They showed concern only when others were watching. And I noticed something else too. When I stopped giving, they stopped pretending. The warmth disappeared. The patience vanished. The affection dried up. It was never unconditional. One evening, I sat alone in my home, surrounded by reminders of a life spent serving others. Old photographs, worn furniture, items I had bought not for myself, but because someone else needed them. I looked around and asked myself a question that hurt more than any accusation. If I disappeared tomorrow, who would truly feel it? Not who would be inconvenienced, not who would struggle financially, but who would grieve me? The answer terrified me. Around that time, my health took a turn. It wasn't sudden. It was the kind of decline that comes from years of neglect. Neglect I had normalized. Fatigue became constant. Pain lingered longer. Simple tasks felt heavy. I mentioned it once, briefly. I'm not feeling well. Someone replied, distracted, you should get that checked. That was it. No follow-up, no concern, no offer to help, so I stopped mentioning it. I told myself I could handle it, like I always had. But deep down, I felt something else creeping in, resentment. Not the loud, explosive kind, but the quiet kind that sits in your chest and hardens slowly. I began replaying memories differently now. Times I had shown up sick. Times I had canceled my own plans. Times I had ignored my body's warnings. I had called it love. But love shouldn't cost you your health, your voice, and your identity. Late one night, I overheard another conversation I wasn't meant to hear. They're being dramatic. Someone said, they're acting like a victim. I closed my eyes, victim. That word erased every ounce of remaining doubt. I wasn't being dramatic. I wasn't acting. I was finally reacting to years of being taken for granted. That night, I made a quiet decision. I would stop waiting for them to understand, because understanding requires empathy, and empathy was something they had never been forced to practice with me. I focused inward instead. I rested. I canceled commitments. I took care of myself without apologizing, and as I did, something strange happened. They became angrier. My healing disrupted their comfort. My absence forced them to deal with things I had always handled. Bills were missed. Plans fell apart. Responsibilities collided, and instead of accountability, they blamed me. This wouldn't have happened if you were more involved. We didn't sign up for this. You're changing the family dynamic. No, I was exposing it. Then came the moment that changed everything. A serious health scare. One that could no longer be ignored. I needed help. Not money, not favors. Just presence. I reached out. The responses were slow. The excuses quick. I'm busy. I'll call later. Can't someone else handle it? Someone else. That was the moment I understood what too late really meant. It didn't mean death. It meant realization. Realizing that I had given my best years to people who never learned how to show up for me. Realizing that love without boundaries had taught them indifference. and realizing that if something truly happened to me, they would be shocked, they would be sad, they would say we didn't know. But they did know, they just didn't listen, because I had always been strong, and strong people are expected to endure silently. As I lay there that night, exhausted and alone, I stopped hoping they would change. Instead, I accepted the truth. Sometimes people don't appreciate you until the version of you they depended on is gone. And by then it's already too late. After that night, the night I truly understood what too late meant, I stopped expecting anything from them. No comfort, no apology, no sudden awakening. Expectations had been my greatest source of pain. Letting go of them felt like grief, but also like relief. When you stop hoping people will become who they never chose to be, you finally see them clearly, and clarity changes everything. I focused on surviving, on conserving what little strength I had left. I rearranged my days around rest instead of responsibility. I canceled plans without explanations. I let messages go unanswered, not out of spite, but because I no longer had the energy to perform emotional labor for people who never carried any for me. That's when the silence became noticeable, not for me. For them, the first signs were small but telling: confusion, discomfort, unease. Things started falling apart in ways they hadn't expected. Bills were forgotten, appointments missed, plans overlapped and collapsed. The invisible structure I had maintained for years, quietly, efficiently, was gone, and without it, chaos crept in. At first, they blamed circumstances. Things are just hectic lately. Life's been overwhelming. Then they blamed each other. You were supposed to handle that. No, I thought you did. And finally, they blamed me. You've really checked out. This family used to function better. I listened without defending myself. Because I finally understood something important. If they truly cared, they would ask why, not assign blame. One evening, someone confronted me directly. You know, everything's harder since you stopped being so involved. I looked at them calmly and said something I had never allowed myself to say before. Then you must not have realized how much I was carrying. They didn't respond. Because acknowledging that truth meant acknowledging something else. That they had benefited from my exhaustion without ever acknowledging the cost. That's when the guilt started creeping in. Not genuine guilt yet. Not remorse, but discomfort. They began checking in more often. Not about my health, but about my availability. How are you feeling? Translation: can you help again? I'm resting. I'd reply, and every time I said that, the distance between us grew heavier. I noticed something strange during this time. They began reminiscing. Remember how you always handled everything. You were so good at keeping things together. They spoke about my sacrifices like memories, not commitments. I was no longer expected to give, but I was still expected to be available if things got bad enough. That realization hardened something inside me. I wasn't a person to them. I was a backup plan. Around this time, my health demanded attention again. Doctor's visits, tests, long waiting rooms, quiet realizations. I didn't tell them everything, not because I wanted revenge, but because I finally understood that vulnerability should be shared with people who know how to handle it. They hadn't earned that access. Still, word got out. Someone mentioned it casually. He's been seeing doctors a lot. She hasn't been well lately. That's when the tone shifted, slightly. Concern entered the conversation, but it was awkward. Unpracticed, like a language they didn't speak fluently. You okay? Everything fine? I nodded. I'm managing. They didn't ask how. They didn't offer help, because deep down, they still assumed I would handle it, like I always had. But something else was happening beneath the surface. Regret was forming, not the kind that changes behavior, but the kind that stings quietly when people realize they may have pushed too far. They started noticing my absence in photos. My quiet at gatherings, my lack of involvement in decisions. One evening, someone said softly, almost to themselves, "It feels different without you doing everything." I looked at them and replied gently, "It always was different. You just didn't feel it before." That sentence lingered in the air. Because it carried truth, and truth makes people uncomfortable when it exposes neglect. Still, no one apologized, not yet. Apologies require accountability, And accountability requires admitting that you benefited from someone else's suffering. That's a hard thing to face, so instead they hovered, watched, waited, as if hoping I'd bounce back, as if this phase would pass and the old version of me, the endlessly giving one, would return, but that version of me was gone. Not because I was bitter, but because I finally understood that love without limits teaches people to take without gratitude. Late one night, alone with my thoughts, I realized something heartbreaking and freeing at the same time. They were starting to miss me, but not enough to change, not yet, and that's when I knew the real test was still ahead, because appreciation that comes only after loss is never the same as appreciation given freely. And soon, they would be forced to confront the full weight of what they had taken for granted, not through arguments, not through explanations, but through absence, and that absence would speak louder than anything I had ever said for most of my life. They believed I was unbreakable. No matter how much weight they placed on my shoulders, I carried it. No matter how tired I was, I showed up. No matter how much I gave, I asked for nothing in return. Strength became my reputation, and reputations can be dangerous. Because when people believe you're indestructible, they stop worrying about the damage they cause. The shift began quietly. I stopped attending gatherings altogether. At first, it was explained away, they're resting, or they couldn't make it today. But absence has a way of forcing attention, even when silence is easier. Someone noticed the empty chair. Someone noticed the missing voice. Someone noticed the lack of follow-up, not because they missed me, but because things felt unsettled without my presence. Then came the day I didn't answer my phone, not for hours, not for a full day. That's when concern finally replaced irritation. Calls came in rapid succession. Messages piled up. Voices shifted from annoyance to worry. Have you heard from them? This isn't like them. Something feels off. I was at an appointment, alone, sitting in a cold room, listening to words that made my chest feel heavy, words about limits, about warning signs, about what happens when exhaustion goes ignored for too long. For the first time in my life, someone looked at me and didn't see strength. They saw risk. When I finally checked my phone, I saw the missed calls. The messages, the panic that had arrived too late. I didn't respond right away, not because I wanted them to worry, but because I needed time to process something I had never allowed myself to consider before. What if I couldn't bounce back this time? What if the version of me they depended on was truly gone? That night, I sent a simple message. I'm okay. I just needed medical attention. The response was immediate. What happened? Why didn't you tell us? You scared us. Scared. That word carried weight. Not fear of losing me, but fear of losing what I provided. Still, something had changed. They started showing up. Not consistently, not comfortably, but awkwardly. Visits felt forced, conversations cautious. They didn't know how to talk to someone they had always treated as invincible. How are you feeling? They asked. I'm tired, I replied honestly. They nodded, unsure what to say next, because they had never learned how to support me, only how to rely on me. I noticed guilt beginning to surface in their eyes, in their pauses, in the way they avoided certain topics. Someone said quietly one day, "We didn't realize how much you were carrying." I almost laughed. Almost, instead, I said something gentle but firm. I carried it because no one else would. That sentence landed hard. Because it couldn't be argued, they began revisiting the past out loud now. You were always there. You never complained. We thought you were fine. There it was, we thought you were fine, as if silence meant strength. As if endurance meant consent. I watched them struggle with that realization. But realization doesn't equal repair. Some things can't be undone. The body remembers neglect. The heart remembers loneliness. The soul remembers being unseen. Even as they tried to be present now, something had shifted permanently. I no longer trusted their concern, because it came from fear, not understanding. Fear of losing something they depended on. Fear of consequences. Fear of guilt, not love. One afternoon, someone said something that confirmed everything. We really need you to get better. Things aren't the same without you. They meant it kindly, But all I heard was the truth. They needed me functional, not valued. I looked at them and responded softly. I need to get better for myself. They didn't reply, because that was a version of me they didn't know how to relate to. The days passed slowly after that. I rested more, spoke less, observed everything. They tried to fill the gaps now, but clumsily. Tasks I had done effortlessly became stressful for them. Decisions overwhelmed them. And for the first time, they saw the cost of what I had given, not in money, not in time, but in wear, the wear on my body, the wear on my spirit, the wear on a life spent putting others first. Late one night, I lay awake thinking about everything I had sacrificed and everything I had lost. And I realized something painful but necessary. They were beginning to appreciate me, but appreciation that comes from fear of loss is never as pure as appreciation given from love. Still, this was only the beginning. Because the next stage wouldn't be about fear. It would be about regret, and regret has a way of arriving when it can no longer change the outcome. Regret doesn't arrive loudly. It doesn't burst through the door or announce itself with apologies and tears. It creeps in quietly after the fear fades and the reality settles. It shows up in the moments when people replay the past and realize how differently they could have acted if only they had paid attention sooner. That's when it started for them, not when I got sick, not when I disappeared from gatherings, but when they were forced to live without the version of me they had depended on for decades. I watched it unfold from a distance. They struggled with decisions I used to make effortlessly. They argued over responsibilities I had quietly handled alone. They grew exhausted from burdens I had carried without complaint. And slowly, uncomfortably, they began to understand. This wasn't about one task or one favor. This was about a lifetime of unpaid emotional labor. I noticed the way conversations changed when my name came up. Do you remember how they used to handle this? They always knew what to do. We should have helped more. That last sentence lingered. We should have helped more, not we should have appreciated them, not we should have listened. Help still framed around function, but it was a start. One evening, someone sat beside me quietly. No agenda, no request. Just silence. After a long pause, they said, "I didn't realize how alone you must have felt." I didn't respond immediately because that sentence came years too late. Finally, I said, "I was alone long before I ever stopped helping." They looked down. That was the moment regret truly surfaced. Not as guilt meant to be resolved quickly, but as a weight they couldn't shake. They began asking questions now, real ones. Why didn't you ever say anything? Why didn't you tell us you were struggling? I answered honestly. Because every time I tried, it was dismissed, and eventually I learned that silence kept the peace. That truth hurt them, because it meant they hadn't just overlooked my pain. They had trained me to hide it. Regret started changing their behavior, but awkwardly. They tried to help now, but didn't know how. They offered solutions when I needed presence, advice when I needed listening. They were learning something late in life that most people never want to admit. Caring is a skill. And they had never practiced it with me. One day, someone broke down. "I feel terrible," they said. "We took you for granted." That was the first time anyone had said it out loud. I didn't feel relief. I felt sadness, because acknowledgement doesn't erase damage. It only names it. I didn't need perfection. I replied quietly, I needed to matter. That sentence ended the conversation, because it struck at the core of everything. I mattered only when I was useful, only when I was strong, only when I was available. Now that I wasn't, they were forced to confront something painful. They had loved what I gave, not who I was. The regret deepened when they realized they couldn't fix this by doing better now. Time doesn't work that way. You can't retroactively show up. You can't rewind neglect. You can't pour care into years that already passed. They tried anyway, more calls, more visits, more concern, but it felt different now. Not because I didn't appreciate the effort, but because something inside me had changed permanently. I had learned how to exist without expecting them. And once you learn that, you can't unlearn it. One afternoon, someone said softly, "I wish we could go back." I looked at them and said something that surprised even me. So do I, but not to change you, to save myself. That was the truth. I didn't want revenge. I didn't want guilt. I didn't want grand apologies. I wanted my life back, the part of it I had given away piece by piece to people who didn't know how to hold it. Regret sat heavy in the room after that, because they finally understood the cost, not the cost to them, but the cost to me, and they understood something else too. Some lessons arrive when there's nothing left to prove, only something left to mourn. Acceptance doesn't mean forgiveness. That was the first thing I had to understand. For a long time, I thought healing meant letting everything go, pretending the hurt never happened, smiling through memories that still stung, reassuring others that it was all okay now. But it wasn't. And pretending only kept me trapped in the same role I had always played, the one who absorbed pain so everyone else could stay comfortable. Acceptance, I learned, was something different. It was the quiet decision to stop begging for understanding from people who were only just learning how to listen. I stopped explaining myself, not out of anger, but exhaustion. I had already lived the story. I didn't need to keep narrating it for people who had ignored it while it was happening. They noticed the change. You're distant. Someone said one day, you've changed. Another remarked. I nodded. Yes, I replied. I had to. They expected more words, more justification, but I didn't give it, because growth doesn't ask permission. For the first time in my life, I started making decisions based on how I felt, not how others might react. I rested when I was tired. I said no without guilt. I chose silence over explanation, and strangely, the world didn't collapse. What collapsed instead was the illusion that I was only valuable when I was available. That illusion had shaped my entire life. They struggled with this new version of me. I wasn't harsh. I wasn't cold. I was simply no longer endlessly accommodating, and that confused them more than anger ever would have. You don't need to shut us out, someone said. I looked at them carefully and answered, I'm not shutting you out. I'm finally letting myself in. That sentence changed everything, because it revealed a truth they hadn't considered. I hadn't been living for myself. I had been surviving for them. The more I stepped back, the more they noticed the space I used to fill, not emotionally, but practically. Things fell apart, miscommunications, missed details, unfinished plans, and with each small failure, the weight of realization grew heavier. They had relied on me without recognizing it. One evening, someone admitted, we don't know how you did all this alone. I smiled faintly. Neither did I. I said, I just didn't think I had a choice. That silence that followed was different from before. It wasn't defensive. It was reflective. They were beginning to understand that my sacrifices weren't heroic. They were necessary because no one else stepped up. And now, I wasn't stepping up anymore. Not because I couldn't, but because I wouldn't. There's a powerful shift that happens when you stop seeking validation from the people who withheld it the longest. You stop performing. You stop proving. You stop shrinking. I started doing things just because they brought me peace. Long walks alone, quiet mornings, simple routines that didn't revolve around anyone else's needs. For the first time, my life felt like it belonged to me. They noticed my calm. You seem lighter, someone said, almost surprised. I am. I replied, because I was no longer carrying the weight of expectations that were never acknowledged. Not everyone reacted well. Some felt abandoned. Some felt guilty. Some felt entitled to my forgiveness simply because they now felt remorse. But remorse doesn't erase impact, and love doesn't demand access. One difficult conversation stands out. Someone asked, so what now? Are we just supposed to live with this? I answered gently, yes, just like I did. That wasn't cruelty, that was honesty, because consequences don't disappear just because regret arrives. And healing doesn't require reopening wounds for the comfort of those who caused them. I wasn't closing the door. I was choosing how wide it stayed open. That boundary was new for them and for me. They were learning how to love without taking. And I was learning how to exist without disappearing. There's a quiet dignity in choosing yourself after a lifetime of self-erasure. It doesn't come with applause. It doesn't look dramatic. It simply feels right. And for the first time, I wasn't afraid of being misunderstood, because I finally understood myself. There comes a point when silence is no longer avoidance. It becomes a mirror, And the people who once filled the room with noise suddenly have to face what they've been running from. That's where we were now. The conversations they avoided for years were finally happening. But the timing had changed everything. They spoke with urgency now, as if realizing the truth late meant they could rush the repair. They wanted clarity, they wanted reassurance, they wanted to know where they stood. But I no longer measured my life in their comfort. One evening they gathered, not formally but with intention. You could feel it. This wasn't about logistics or favors. This was about reckoning. Someone spoke first. We need to talk about what happened, about how we treated you. I listened, not with hope, not with fear, but with steadiness. They admitted things slowly, clumsily, that we didn't listen, that we assumed you were fine, that we expected you to always be there. Each sentence landed heavy, not because it was new, but because it was finally being said. Then came the question they'd been building toward. What can we do to fix this? I breathed in before answering. Some things can't be fixed. I said calmly, they can only be understood. That wasn't what they wanted to hear. They wanted tasks, actions, a checklist for redemption, but relationships don't work like broken furniture. You don't repair them by tightening screws after the structure has warped. Someone asked quietly, "Are you angry?" I thought about it. I answered, for a long time, but anger needs energy, and I don't have any left to give it. That honesty unsettled them, because anger is something you can apologize to. Peace is harder. Peace means the person has moved on. Another voice broke. "We didn't know you felt this way." I met their eyes. "I know," I said, "that's part of the problem." They were finally grasping the depth of it. This wasn't one mistake, it was a pattern. Years of dismissal, years of emotional absence, years of mistaking resilience for invulnerability. And now they were living with the consequences. Someone tried to shift the tone. "We love you," they said. I didn't doubt that. But love without awareness is incomplete. "I believe you," I replied, "but love doesn't excuse neglect." That sentence changed the room because it challenged a belief they had held tightly. That intention mattered more than impact. It doesn't. Impact shapes memory. Impact shapes trust. Impact shapes whether someone feels safe enough to stay open. They asked if I could forgive them. I answered carefully. "Forgiveness isn't a performance," I said. "It's something that happens when healing catches up with harm, and I'm still healing." They nodded, but I could see the disappointment. They wanted closure. I wanted truth. One final question came, hesitant but necessary. "Are you ever going to be the same again?" I smiled gently. "No," I said, "but neither are you, and that's not a bad thing, because growth doesn't restore, it transforms." They were grieving the version of me that made their lives easier. I was protecting the version of me that finally felt whole. Those two things couldn't coexist anymore. As the conversation ended, something unspoken settled between us. They understood, not fully, but enough. Enough to know that love delayed doesn't always get rewarded. Enough to know that presence matters when it's needed, not when it's convenient. Enough to know that some relationships don't end with explosions. They end with quiet acceptance. I walked away from that conversation feeling something unexpected. Not relief, but resolution. Because I had finally said everything I needed to say. And I no longer needed them to understand in order to move forward. There is a strange peace that comes when you stop waiting. Not waiting for apologies. Not waiting for appreciation. Not waiting for someone to finally see what you gave up. That peace found me quietly. Not all at once, but in small moments that added up. Mornings where I woke up without heaviness. Evenings where silence felt comforting instead of lonely. Days where my worth no longer depended on being needed. I realized something important. I had spent most of my life believing love meant endurance, that if I just stayed longer, gave more, tried harder, eventually, someone would notice. But love was never supposed to be something you survive. It was supposed to be something that meets you halfway. They still reached out, sometimes awkwardly, sometimes cautiously, sometimes with guilt woven into their kindness, and I accepted what felt genuine. Not out of obligation, but choice. That was the difference now. I was no longer afraid of losing them because I had already lost myself once, and I wasn't willing to do that again. One day, someone said something that stayed with me. "I wish we had appreciated you before." I nodded. "So do I," I replied, "but wishing doesn't change the past, it only teaches the future." That was the lesson, not punishment, not bitterness, but awareness. They had learned too late how much I carried, and I had learned, finally, how to put it down. I didn't erase the past, I honored it by refusing to repeat it. I stopped overextending, I stopped explaining my boundaries. I stopped proving my love through sacrifice. Instead, I lived gently, I lived honestly, I lived for myself, and something unexpected happened. As I healed, I became an example, not through lectures, but through change. They began checking in on each other more. They began listening better. They began noticing the quiet ones in the room, not perfectly, but intentionally. That mattered. I realized then that my life hadn't been wasted. Even the unappreciated years held meaning, because they taught me what I deserved, and they taught others, through loss, what they should never take for granted again. If there's one truth I carry forward, it's this: love that arrives late is still real, but it doesn't undo the damage of absence. And self-worth doesn't wait for permission. I don't regret loving deeply. I regret believing that love required my disappearance. Now, I exist fully, not as a sacrifice, not as a safety net, not as the strong one who never breaks, but as a person, whole, enough, at peace. And if my story teaches anything, let it be this: appreciate the ones who show up quietly, listen before silence becomes distance, and never wait until it's too late to value someone who gave you everything.